Hello and welcome to another episode of Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride and I'm joined at the table today by regular guest, Rural Leader Day Tucker, and by Director of EU Citizens for an Independent Scotland and regular friend of the show, Ellen Hofer. Ellen, how are you today?
Hi, I'm okay.
And Day, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Splendid. Well, our first story takes us to Germany, Ellen. So, a gunman with suspected far-right links shot dead 9 people, some of them migrants from Turkey, in an overnight rampage through a German city before killing himself, officials have said. Chancellor Angela Merkel condemned the attack on 2 shisha bars in Hanau, near Frankfurt. She told reporters it appeared to have been motivated by the poison of racism that was to blame for too many crimes, as Turkish officials called on her government to respond robustly. The presumed killer was a 43-year-old German man who held a firearms licence and was a member of a gun club. Police chased a car used to leave the scene of one shooting to its owner's address, where they found his body and that of his 72-year-old mother, said Peter Beuth, Interior Minister of Hesse State, where Hanau is located. Federal prosecutors said they had taken charge of the case due to its likely extremist motive, and newspaper Bild said the suspect had expressed far-right views in a written confession. Now, Helen, you are from Frankfurt, aren't you? Yeah. So, obviously, you know the area a wee bit. I mean, what does this story say to you?
Well, Frankfurt, in the context of Germany, is one of the most international and diverse cities, and Hanau is not all that far off Frankfurt, so it's not very far away. It really breaks my heart. And I don't really have much to say on it either. It's not just a tragedy, it is an act of terrorism on people, on human lives, based on their race, and we're seeing it all over Europe. We're seeing it resurfacing. It's not that far away in the UK as well, and we're obviously seeing a lot of these sort of racially motivated attacks here as well.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there is a quite a huge Turkish population in Germany, and in general, they're fairly well integrated. It's not like this is a relatively new development. These kind of attacks, isn't it?
No. After the war, in the phase of rebuilding Germany, an awful lot of people came from all over Europe and other places in the world, and the Turks were one of the main groups that settled in Germany and has had a huge impact on German culture. A very beautiful contribution that has made Germany open up in many ways. My own father is Italian, or at least half Italian, and I was on the phone to him just a couple of days before this happened, and he said to me that while he was in school, he was still being singled out by, he was sitting in a class and his teacher was talking to the class about how if 2 races mix, it always takes the genes, from the worst of both parts.
Wow.
He was the only person in the class to have mixed blood, so it was a very clear thing. Equally, my own grandfather held pretty horrendous views, and every time something in my life went wrong until he passed away, it was down to my genes. There's a very deep and not often talked about ingrained and kind of belief, and it's not one that is exclusive to Germany.
At the same time, though, AfD, the alternative for Deutschland, which is the kind of hard right party, the closest to something like UKIP that Germany has, are a relatively new development.
Yes.
Until recently, Germany has kind of kept a lot of that, at least out of the polite society, out of Parliament, out of kind of mainstream politics, and now it's started to come back in. Do you think there's a parallel there with the kind of rise in anti-Semitic attacks, anti-Islamic attacks? Or are there other factors that you think are playing in there?
I think it does have something to do with it. Germany has very strict laws that are specifically concerned with the contrast between freedom of speech and hate speech. Yes, you're allowed to say whatever you want to, unless it is hate speech. That sort of policy has led to the far right building a more socially acceptable face to right-wing extremism, and we see that actually replicated across Europe and the world as well. The leaders of these parties now are females. Their fertility is being their motherliness, their fertility is being used as a tool to represent them as the whole world, as the center of a whole universe. And so it is a new approach on a very old theme. And it's one that we're all not safe from. But I noticed that quite specifically in Germany, there's a very specific drill towards making this a more socially acceptable kind of fascism.
Yeah, it's a tragedy. Whatever happens, I mean, 9 people dead is never. There's just no good way of looking at this. It's a real tragedy. Anyway, we have to move on though to a story here in Scotland, and I know, Ellen, you have been following this story very closely. This is the Scottish Elections Franchise and Representation Bill, which passed today in Parliament by 92 votes to 27. Now, tell us a wee bit about this, because you've been following this story, and it's I know you've been lobbying on this as well. So tell us a bit about what the bill is and why, how you're responding to it. Let's say.
This is going to be a walk on eggshells for me, I think. I don't think there's been an occasion where I've been on this programme or on this channel and haven't mentioned the electoral franchise bill. I have talked about it at every opportunity. It's something that I've been looking forward to literally for years. I had pretty great expectations, and to be fair, it started out with great expectations. Scotland set a benchmark and announced that it was going to do this about 2 years ago with the intention of enfranchising refugees, asylum seekers, third country nationals, and giving the voting franchise to prisoners who up until then didn't have the voting franchise at all, which represents a human rights violation. And that was one of the main topics that came up today. It also was meant to return rights that EU citizens lost in Scotland due to Brexit. And the bill passed today. There has been quite some significant changes to what the bill originally was intending to do, and the fact that it has taken such an awful long time for this to pass through the Scottish Parliament has also led to Wales fantastically being able to overtake Scotland, and in Germany you would say to overtake us from the left. Wales, in contrast to the Scottish proposition, which is that prisoners who have received sentences of less than 12 months will now receive the voting franchise and will be entitled to vote even while they're incarcerated. Wales has extended this to prisoners with sentences of up to 4 years. So in that way, they have gone far above and beyond. If anybody's followed the discussion today in the Parliament, will have been surprised to see the Tories continuing to argue against giving any electoral franchise to prisoners at all. Their worldview continues to be that prison is meant to be a penalising system rather than a system for reform. And there was some real crackers in that discussion. I can't number them enough, but to be honest, I had hoped that today was going to be a happier occasion. Yeah.
No, I mean, it's not all negative by any means. I mean, it does secure the rights of some prisoners to vote, does secure the right of refugees to vote. Asylum seekers aren't covered though under this, and now the status of third country nationals. Third country nationals will be included. Is that right? So, what more then would you have liked to see? Is it the asylum seekers and prisoners are there still issues for other non-native votes?
There are other qualifiers attached to who is now included in the franchise. If we're talking about EU nationals having been returned their rights, that's not quite accurate. By now there's a stipulation on EU nationals running for office, so they have to have either indefinite leave to remain or pre-settled status or settled status. For those EU nationals that will be arriving in the UK after Brexit, there's a whole different immigration system that still isn't very clear. As we've seen with this whole points-based nonsense, these people are all going to fall into the same category. So they will be enfranchised, but will only be able to run for office at a certain point when they have received a status applicable. For me, that would mean if I had any interest in running, for example, in a by-election right now, if I did that now and I was lucky enough to get elected, by the end of the year, I still haven't applied for settled status. That means that I would become an illegal immigrant in January next year, which should technically, by the logic of the Scottish government and Mike Russell, who today argued that asylum seekers shouldn't be included because their status isn't secure in the franchise whatsoever, it kind of cancels out that argument, because anybody's status can change within a heartbeat. That includes third country nationals whose visas can just not be renewed.
Well, as we've discovered recently, the British government will strip British citizens of their citizenship if they happen to have an appropriate relative in Bangladesh.
Yes.
I mean, that's literally what's happened to British citizens. We've seen it a couple of times recently. People have had their British passports taken off them.
Yes.
They've been stripped of citizenship. So yeah, I agree with you there. That's something that does really need to be watched. And just to explain a little bit as well about settled status, because this is something that a lot of people still don't understand very well. Settled status is not something that's automatically granted to you. This is something you have to apply for and then just hope that the Home Office makes the right decision without any kind of form of appeal possible. So, I mean, is there a concern there amongst kind of EU citizens groups that this is going to be used as a political weapon?
It is being used as a political weapon right now. The franchise is kind of disconnected from that because it's the responsibility of the devolved administrations to give those voting rights, though it makes me severely wonder about those EU nationals who are residing in England, who don't have a devolved parliament and whose voting rights would be passed through Westminster. Fat chance.
Yeah.
So there's a good chance that Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland will give EU citizens in the country voting rights in local and,
and devolved elections, yeah.
Yeah.
But
not for England. But yes, settled status is absolutely a political tool. The immigration changes and policy proposals that have just been put before us in the last couple of days with the points-based system. If any of you had a look on Twitter, you should have a good overview over what kind of caliber of people and with what kind of careers would still be considered low-skilled and not applicable to come to the UK. And this is UK nationals.
Yeah.
This is absolutely a step in a very, very worrying xenophobic direction, institutionalized in the very makeup of the UK.
Yeah, now Day, sorry to have kind of left you out of the discussion. Obviously, Ellen has some expert insight to offer us there. What's your reaction to this bill? I mean, as Ellen says, it does secure some rights for a fairly broad section of the population whose rights were either unclear or hadn't been stipulated. Is this something that we should be welcoming, or are you kind of feeling that same concern about it as Ellen?
No, I am of the same. Yes, I'm disappointed that it has taken us. We're supposed to be the first of the devolved nations that are standing up and going to separate ourselves away from the UK and its xenophobia and all the rest of it, and yet we've been overtaken by the other two devolved nations. What is going on in our Scottish Parliament?
Yeah, I mean, it has been kind of an odd thing to see Wales overtake Scotland on just about any devolved matter. I mean, one of the things we often point out on the show is Labour-run Wales is not doing the things that Labour says the SNP ought to be doing in Scotland. So what do you think this is something that will be a continued campaign, or do you think this is just going to fizzle out now?
I think it should be a continued campaign, and I'm quite sure that Ellen will put her back into it to make sure that it does continue.
You just see that wee twinkle appear in
And
Ellen's eye when you say that.
Fairness comes out in the end, and doing the right thing comes out in the end. I'm truly disappointed in our Scottish government.
And on the lobbying front, had you been given any indication from the Scottish government that there was scope for to go further, or was this just constantly a kind of small disappointment after small disappointment? Are there particular people you don't want to throw under the bus here?
I'm trying to preserve whatever good working relationships I'm able to have at this point. But I can, as Day says, it is disappointing that the devolved administration with by far the greatest powers has been least able to do something about this, especially considering that they were the ones that started it off and had the energy behind it. Wales essentially went and copied a year ago what Scotland was talking about and then put it into law. The year that they have taken to make this law, Scotland has taken to dismantle its own ideals. And I think this is a very, very worrying trend, considering that this is a government that prides itself into being progressive and left of centre. We are cowtailing in the same way that the EU is starting to cowtail to the more right-wing forces and trying to make something more digestible to the right wing of politics. What that inevitably does is to drag politics more to the right.
Yeah, there's very little kind of reciprocal movement back to the left from the right when you try and make when you try and build that bridge. There's very little meeting in the middle. Almost always rightward movement, isn't it?
Completely, and conservatism. Look at the core of the word. It's about conservation of the status quo. It is about conserving, and if you're willing to change something in a big and progressive way, being conservative about it is not the way to go. I'm sorry, but if we're looking down south and Scotland is supposed to lift its eyes to a better horizon with an independent Scotland, we shouldn't be trying to become more right-wing in the progress of that. It is an incredibly difficult topic to talk about. It's not like the campaigning that I've been doing for the last 3 years, I've been doing off my own back. And I have been quite naive when I started out. I thought that somebody like me coming with ideas and with energy and with the will to make a difference would be more welcome. But over the course of the 3 years, I've learned that I am probably more of an annoyance than a help in the eyes of those that should probably feel differently about me. I'm not trying to be an enemy, and I'm not favouring any party in particular. For me, it's about policies that work or that don't work for the people, and I'm really starting to run out of hope. Yeah,
and of course this should have been a day when we were celebrating that these rights had been all secured. So.
But is there any one category that has caused more of a focus of worry for these people making the decisions? All the people who are to be granted rights, is there one category that
the biggest category of this is probably going to sound quite funny, but the biggest category that held back this bill on a lot of levels was prisoners' voting rights. The amount of people that we're talking about here is 800 compared to 200,000 EU citizens and 50,000 non-EU citizens in the country. 800 people. Because on the same day that the Scottish government announced that it was going to give the franchise to prisoners with sentences of less than 12 months, they also announced that there was going to be a presumption against short sentences, which is sentences in less than 12 months. So we actually have just extended voting rights and delayed this bill
to a population that may not exist very soon.
Exactly. It's incredibly small now, and it's shrinking by the other policy introduced on the same day. I'm sorry, I cannot be happy about this. I've spent the last couple of years looking forward to this day, and I'm bitterly disappointed.
Yes.
Well, unfortunately, we do have to move on to another Brexit-related story. The UK government's determination to force through a destructive and damaging hard Brexit means the Scottish government must step up its efforts to defend Scotland's interests. Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution, Michael Russell, said those driving UK government Brexit policy were not interested in listening to calls for a softer Brexit, and people in Scotland should be under no illusion about the damage that would be caused. The UK government has made clear that it will not commit to aligning with EU standards or accept the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Addressing the Scottish Parliament's Culture, Europe and External Relations Committee today, Mr Russell said this would result in new barriers to trade and exports, a fall in national income compared to EU membership, and damage to social care and the NHS. Consequently, the Scottish Government will now further prioritise work to mitigate the damage while seeking to give Scotland the right to choose a different path. A new continuity bill will be introduced to the Scottish Parliament soon, which would make it easier to align with future EU standards in areas such as the environment and human rights. In addition, the Scottish Government will seek to protect vulnerable exports such as seafood and red meat, press for continued participation in EU research and student programmes, and seek replacements for security initiatives, including the EU arrest warrant. And this is very much the line that the SNP has been taking ever since the Brexit vote, and there have been efforts to try and ensure that there is some sort of continuity. But several of these issues are devolved areas where Scotland does get to make its own policy and therefore would be able to maintain some level of alignment with the EU, even if the UK doesn't necessarily. What's your take on this? I mean, is this just Mike Russell kind of waving a flag and saying, "Don't forget we're working on this," or "We need to work on this," or do you think there's something more that's more urgent now, perhaps?
No, I don't think so. All I know as a farmer is that we've been told we are still in the EU during the transition period. We must not break any rules or we lose our payments. But we don't know what's going to happen after that. And nobody knows what's going to happen after that. We may well go for independence.
And of course,
but even in the transition period, obviously that leaves farmers hanging.
Oh, we're hanging, there's no doubt about it. And don't forget, farming isn't something that you can turn on and switch off.
Yeah, you've got to make plans for next season.
It's a 5-year plan. Which is why the programmes run for 5 years.
Absolutely.
And have you been in communication with the UK government over this, or has this predominantly been the Scottish government?
The union has, definitely. They've been in right from the start. Not that I've enjoyed watching the way they've had to deal with the UK government, knowing as I do that you've got the likes of Gove who you can't trust at all, and there they are sitting with Gove round the tables up in the northeast.
Well, I imagine
all men round the table and one woman at the back who's giving them cups of tea and everything. I love NFUS, but they really annoy me in certain ways. And that's one of the ways that they annoy me. But they have to do it, as Ellen said. I mean, even you are saying you've got to be careful because you've got to work with people and bring them on board. And that's the situation that our Farmers Union is in. It's got to work with these people.
Yeah. And Ellen, what's your take on this? Do you think there's much the Scottish Government can or will do to maintain that closeness with the EU, even as the UK insists that it has to diverge, even if divergence is the worst idea? They seem we were talking about this on the show yesterday, but this idea that they have to diverge just to prove that Brexit was worth it somehow. Do you see the Scottish Government kind of making efforts to avoid that divergence?
in the same way that you say the UK government has to kind of prove that it's making a success of Brexit, there is a suggestion that the Scottish government has to prove that Brexit is a terrible mistake, and that is done by economic impact on Scotland. That might be a cynical analysis, but in the absence of seeing significant progressive and protective reforms, it is a fair guess at what might be going on behind the scenes. There's a pain point. We're trying to convert people from no to yes. That pain point may well be the economy dipping. I actually personally think that one of the main areas is exactly the area that Day is talking about. It is about agriculture. The the Scottish Government has control over land reform and has still not done anything significant about it. If we're talking about alignment with the EU or even international Western, first world countries, Scotland is so far behind it can't even see its next neighbour when it comes to inequality of land ownership. If we want to align, if we want to show ourselves as progressive, maybe start at that. And it's not going to happen by appointing one of the most conservative SNP representatives you can to the area most in need of reform.
Well, Mr. Russell, just to give the quote here, the UK government is determined to pursue a destructive and damaging hard Brexit. As of today, devolved ministers have been given no chance to even look at its negotiating mandate, let alone influence it. We will, of course, continue trying to protect Scotland's interests, but unless something fundamental changes, the UK intends to inflict the hardest of Brexits on us, rather than negotiating with us. We must stand up for ourselves to stop that happening. And this goes to, I think, what kind of both of you have said, that there's just this real difficulty in getting anyone talking properly. There's just blocks in communication on all levels.
But overarching everything in terms of agriculture, I've always thought, and I think the Scottish Government realises as well, that agriculture in Scotland is producing a niche product. We're not producing volume like they are down in England.
Yeah.
And it does make sense to stick to that niche product, and the niche demands are coming from the EU. And even, let's face it, there must be loads of people down in England who want to have that high quality niche product and are prepared to pay that bit extra to get it.
Yeah, that's something that we've talked extensively with Keep Scotland the brand here on the show. That's something that the UK government seems to have had no interest in focusing on.
No.
Perhaps because there's so much value available in selling Scotch whisky and selling the brand of Scotch whisky to the Americans. But anyway, we have to move on. And this is another EU-related story, though. Google is to move the data and user accounts of its British users from the EU to the US, placing them outside the strong privacy protections offered by European regulators. The shift, prompted by the UK's exit from the EU, will leave the sensitive personal information of tens of millions not covered by Europe's world-leading General Data Protection Regulation, and therefore with less protection and within easier reach of British law enforcement. Google intends to require its British users to acknowledge new terms of service, including the new jurisdiction, according to people familiar with the plans. Nothing about our services or our approach to privacy will change, including how we collect or process data and how we respond to law enforcement demands for users' information, Google said in a statement. The protections of the UK GDPR will still apply to these users. Ireland, where Google and other US tech companies have their European headquarters, is staying in the EU, which is one of the world's most aggressive data protection rules, the GDPR. It is understood that Google decided to move its British users out of Irish jurisdiction because it is unclear whether Britain will follow GDPR or adopt other rules that could affect the handling of user data. If British Google users have their data kept in Ireland, it would be more difficult for British authorities to recover it in criminal investigations. The recent Cloud Act in the US, however, is expected to make it easier for British authorities to obtain data from US companies. The issue may come up as the UK seeks to negotiate a broader trade agreement with the US in the coming months and years. And there's one line there that really jumps out at me, which is that if Google left British data in Ireland, even though it would be better protected, it would be harder for British legal authorities to be able to access that data if they need it to investigate a crime. And this was one of the things that has been a result of the EU. Just these things that were barely discussed in 2016, and now we're starting to realise just how complicated all this European cooperation was, and just how difficult it's going to be to make a lot of things that seem just ordinary now. How difficult it's going to be to keep these things working. What's your take on this story? Does it worry you that your data is going to be kept outside the protection of the GDPR, or?
I'm a bit stupid. And,
No.
well, I'm very average when it comes to that sort of thing. And I've got one of these Google hubs. Mm-hmm. The first thing when I said, "Hey Google," and asked it to play Classic FM, and my husband was gobsmacked. He said, "That's like Big Brother." Mm-hmm. And it's probably is watching. I'm thinking, well, what are you going to see? I mean, I'm nearly 75. I'm not going to be a very exciting watch, not very exciting listen, etc., etc. But yes, of course, there are real concerns for people. Mm-hmm. But as for me as an ordinary individual, I don't care. I really don't.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's one of the issues, isn't it, Ellen? Is that very few of us, we look at these privacy agreements on Google, Facebook, whatever, the terms of service, and very few people ever read them. Very few people ever think about how much data companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon are collecting on us. And we think very, very little about how that data is being used. Very often it's being sold and whatnot. Mm-hmm. So as somebody who's maybe a bit younger, a bit more digitally native, as they say, what's your take on this story?
I'm going to have to make a wee curve around this topic. I think this kind of ties in quite well into the last story. How do we align Scotland with more European values? Mm-hmm. It's not going to be on the political path, because politically that can always change. If you want to protect Scotland and the people of Scotland from the impact of losing human rights, GDPR and so on and so forth, you're probably going to have to go through the Scottish judiciary and to make laws that protect Scots based on Scottish law, because this cannot be touched by the British government unless it attempts to, and then it has to come to Scottish courts rather than English courts or British courts. In terms of the GDPR user agreements, this is something that the EU quite recently has done quite reasonable work on. These thousands of pages of user agreements that we all click agree to and just forget about. The EU says these are basically more or less illegal, and that they are not something that you should force upon your users, because it is just unreasonable to expect people to understand and read all of those terms and conditions.
Unless you click on them, you don't get to the next page.
Completely, which is unfortunate for us, because they are making pretty progressive policies happen around that in Europe. And we are just being dragged out. All the more it is important that we take a legal route to protecting the rights of Scotland residents.
I mean, one thing I've discovered recently, I've been spending a lot of time looking at the American elections, as I'm sure regular viewers know, and how many pages are just not accessible because GDPR says, no, you're collecting data in an illegal way, or a way that isn't protected by GDPR. And that frightens me a little bit now, to hear that, we're going to be basically treated as like we were American citizens. Our data rights are going to be those of Americans rather than Europeans, because there is a really marked difference. And Google recently has been seen selling people's health information.
The UK does this as well. And
there's a whole lot of big data questions that are only going to become bigger as we move forward into the future. There's only going to be more of these issues that we have to think about. And the internet is not a one country operation. It covers everywhere, and it's everywhere except China. And therefore there's got to be some sort of level of cooperation, hasn't there?
There does, and there has to be a very distinct and localized understanding of what we're dealing with here. I hate to say it, but welcome to the club, guys. Your GDPR rights are being offended and violated. Mine are being violated just by having to apply for settled status, which entitles the British government to take my data, all of the data I put in, including my iris scan, my fingerprints, and to pass them on to companies and organizations inside the UK and outside of the UK, and I will never know whom they shared it with. That's the cost for me for applying for settled status, other than my hurt ego and the fact that I shouldn't have to do it because I'm applying for rights I've already held, and I'll only get some of them back. So the UK has long been much more aligned with the US, and this Brexit thing is not a surprise in terms of that. The UK is much more interested in having an exploitative capitalist system than a system based on human rights, solidarity, and privacy.
Yeah.
Well, moving on, this is, a fairly fun wee story about one of the architects of Brexit. Betting odds indicate a 25% implied probability of British PM Boris Johnson's senior advisor Dominic Cummings leaving Downing Street by the end of March. Cummings, the former campaign director of Vote Leave in the 2016 referendum, is Johnson's most powerful advisor and thoroughly enjoys courting controversy. He helped prompt the resignation of Sajid Javid as Chancellor last week, and this week faced criticism for the appointment of Andrew Sabisky, a contractor who resigned within days after his views on race, women's sport, forced contraception and eugenics were unearthed. As Boris Johnson's aide continues to make the headlines, the bookies now make it just 3-1 he is axed or walks away voluntarily from number 10 before the clock strikes midnight on March 31st, said Ladbrokes today. Now, this is a fairly,
What's special about March the 31st?
I don't know. I think it's just if the bookies are going to take a bet on anything, they have to put a date on it. One of these kind of things. So I guess this is. Clearly this is just Ladbrokes trying to drum up a wee bit of interest. But it is interesting to think that the odds are that short on this guy who's clearly so much at the heart of Boris Johnson's government. What do you think? Do you think he's likely to go? Do you think this Sabisky case was embarrassing enough that it's going to loosen his grip on Boris, or is he going to stick around for forever and we're never going to get rid of him?
Put it this way, I'm not surprised that the odds are short, but I shouldn't be surprised if he's still hanging in there.
Yeah. What do you think, Ellen? You think Dominic Cummings is going to be continuing to have his malign influence on British politics for another 3 months or another 2 months, or is he going to stick it out longer?
I'm not sure about sticking it out longer. He seems like the ideal candidate for the UK government at the minute. They even refuse to give any comment on his views on eugenics. It's not only that they're embarrassed by it, they're not embarrassed by it, and they're not going to comment on it. So it's a fun wee story, but I don't see him resigning over something that is more embarrassing to the Prime Minister, who's standing full on behind that.
Yeah.
And don't forget, he's been in there with Boris Johnson for many, many years.
Yeah.
He and Gove and all the others, that same team were operating 2008, maybe before that, planning and plotting.
Yeah, it's he's a very strange man, and I really don't understand why anybody listens to him. But that's just my opinion. Not the opinion of Broadcasting Scotland officially, although it might be. Now, our next story. In the States, a federal judge said President Donald Trump's longtime advisor Roger Stone engaged in intolerable, threatening and intimidating conduct towards her as she prepared to sentence him on charges that include lying to lawmakers investigating Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. Signalling that she may not be lenient in her sentencing, US District Judge Amy Berman Jackson told a hearing that Stone knew exactly what he was doing when he posted an image on social media last year that positioned a gun's crosshairs above her face. The defendant engaged in threatening and intimidating conduct towards the court, Jackson said. This is intolerable to the rule of justice. Jackson also said she would not discount tougher sentencing guidelines that apply to witness tampering and obstruction, which were among the 7 criminal counts on which Stone was convicted in November. Stone, whose career as a Republican operative has stretched from the Watergate scandal of the early 70s to Trump's campaign 4 years ago, is in court to be sentenced in a case that has drawn Trump's ire. A jury of 9 women and 3 men convicted Stone, 67, on November 15th on all 7 counts of lying to Congress, obstruction of justice and witness tampering. The charges stemmed from special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation that detailed Russian meddling in the 2016 election to boost Trump's candidacy. Stone was one of several Trump associates charged in Mueller's inquiry, and I believe the sentence has just been announced. I'm just getting word in my ear. What is the sentence then? Have we got it? Okay, we're still just waiting to hear what the actual sentence was. But sorry? 3 1/3 years. Okay, so this was after prosecutors had initially said 7 to 9 years before the Attorney General, apparently under Trump's direction, said no, it shouldn't, and then caused the prosecutors to resign. So yeah, 3 1/3 years. So yeah, this is a fairly shocking thing. But it's something that we've seen all kinds of people do to various people, especially women in high-profile positions over the last however many years. This putting a gun sight on somebody's head in a picture. In the culture of the United States, that's quite a risky thing to do, isn't it?
Oh, completely. It's weaponizing your platform, but on social media, you're weaponizing people following you or not following you and just coming across your tweets or other posts. I think what's quite interesting is that 3 1/3 years is not that big of a sentence. Very strongly reminds me of the story from yesterday where we found out that apparently Julian Assange had a visit from a representative saying she was there in the name of Donald Trump, who said that if he denied any connection to a Russian interference in the leak about Hillary Clinton's hack emails and so on, then he would go free.
Yeah.
I mean, this is hearsay. We don't know if that's the case or if it isn't the case, but it would, in the context of American politics today, this is in no way surprising to anybody paying attention.
Yeah.
Sleight of hand by a corrupt president.
Yeah. Now, obviously, we don't want to question the judge's decision. She's clearly had she's had a very difficult time. She's been the subject of various Trump tweets and Trump accusations and whatnot. And dealing with Roger Stone must be an absolute nightmare. Anyway, this is a man, folks. Not everybody knows this. This is a man who has a tattoo of Richard Nixon on his back that he got in 2007 because he still hero worships the guy. That tells you a lot about what this man's political ethics are. He was found guilty of witness tampering, including threatening a guy, saying something along the lines of "you do this, you're dead." This is so 3.5 years doesn't, or 3 1/3 years doesn't seem like a long time. But what do you think about
Not hugely different to Boris Johnson colluding with another journalist to beat up another journalist.
Indeed, it isn't, and it also, given the pressure that the judge had to operate under, is that a sentence handed out under duress, you would expect that under this huge amount of public, political, presidential pressure, will have some effect.
Yeah, and of course there isn't really a good outcome at this stage, is there? No. Because there are people who are going to say she has folded under political pressure from Trump and Barr. The people who were originally prosecuting the case and recommended the 7 to 9 years are clearly going to feel that their words meant nothing. Yeah. But at the same time, had she gone with the 7 to 9 years that was recommended by the original prosecutors, she would have inevitably come under attack for this is far too severe. Yeah. The Justice Department said this was too severe and said it should be less. So one of these problems, and this is happening in this country as well, is this increasing kind of politicization of the justice process. Yes. Is there something that we can do? Is there something that should be done to prevent this? Or we just, should we stop just politicians being allowed to comment on criminal cases?
Well, I think there are enough very good judges and people, QCs, who are fighting this and trying to put measures in place and trying to make the country aware that we must keep a distance between the law and the politicians. And certainly in Scotland, we recognise it.
Yeah.
Yes, there are barriers put up in Scotland. I think the trick of the UK and the US government at the minute is that they ride roughshod over any rules and regulations faster than either democracy or the judiciary can catch up with them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then in America, the judges are voted for, aren't they?
Well, judges it depends.
Yeah.
Judges are usually appointed by,
Yeah.
but then have the Senate has to approve them. So certainly for like Supreme Court judges, I'm not sure
But
about
it's a lot more
lower level judges.
loose
But
than here.
one of the big campaigns that Trump has had has been to control judge appointments. The Senate had previously stopped Obama appointing any judges and had left these hundreds and hundreds of vacancies that Trump has now thrown tons of people who are expected to be sympathetic to his interests and the interests of the Republicans. And now, as we talked about Dominic Cummings there, Dom wants to sort out the judges. That's what we're hearing, is that's one of his goals. How big a threat to democracy is it, do you think?
Huge.
Huge.
It is absolutely huge. And as I said, the last 17,000 times I've been on this program, these are very clear signs of fascism, of nationalist fascism, where you cross out any media controls, but also any media protections. You turn the people against the judiciary. You scapegoat people for their otherness. These are all tick, 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 and we're seeing more and more of them. It really is no mistake that we have left the EU as the United Kingdom, because we are by far much closer aligned with US political trends than we are with where the EU at least says it's trying to go.
Yeah.
But the annoying thing is, we know that Brexit vote was won on lies and illegal voting system.
Illegal money as well.
It's
Illegal
quite interesting
money.
because we're still waiting for several reports. The new trick of this British government seems to be to commission reports or to receive reports, but then
never
shelve
publish
them
them.
completely. This is true for the Russia report. It is true for a report on EU citizens and the impact of settled status. This is becoming a methodology. It's not an accident.
Yeah. Well, Broadcasting Scotland will always be here and will always be as independent and honest as we can be with you. So hopefully we can be some sort of bulwark against this nonsense. But anyway, moving on. Michael Bloomberg faced a barrage of attacks at his first Democratic presidential debate last night as his rivals attacked the multi-billionaire over his record on race, his history of sexism, and the use of his $60 billion fortune to force his way into the contest. Bloomberg seemed highly uncomfortable and hesitant as he defended his record and argued that he is Democrats' best chance of beating Republican President Donald Trump in November, while the other 5 candidates on stage all sought to bring him down. Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar, Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg all lined up to go after Bloomberg, who has surged in polls, helped by an unprecedented advertising blitz. But they also heaped personal attacks on one another in the most contentious of the debates so far. "We're running against a billionaire who calls women fat broads and horse-faced lesbians," said Warren, a senator from Massachusetts. "And no, I'm not talking about Donald Trump, I'm talking about Mayor Bloomberg. Democrats take a huge risk if we just substitute one arrogant billionaire for another," she added. Bloomberg has been accused over the years of many sexist and misogynistic comments, and several lawsuits have been filed alleging that women were discriminated against at his media company. The media mogul, who entered the race in November and is skipping the first 4 early states in February to focus on the later contests in March, has risen to number 2 among Democrats, behind Democratic Socialist Senator Bernie Sanders, according to national polls published this week. And I don't know if either of you caught this debate. I caught some of it, and honestly, that line from Elizabeth Warren was savage. I mean, you could hear the audience just gasp, like, "Oh, did she really say that? Wow!" But then they all just piled in on him. I mean, they piled in quite hard on Bernie Sanders as well. They piled in on each other. Amy Klobuchar got very upset because Pete Buttigieg kind of implied that she was thick. And I wouldn't possibly agree with him. But, this is just one of these crazy stories. I mean, Michael Bloomberg, £60 billion, the 12th richest man in the world, up until now, didn't have to debate or wasn't even invited to the debates because he's not collecting any money. so he wasn't meeting the donor thresholds. What do you make of a man this rich, a man who owns a TV network, basically buying his way into the political process?
Well, it just seems to be the way things are going. I mean, we see films from way back, like Dr. No, and you actually see that sort of thing happening where somebody is trying to control the world. I didn't know it was Bloomberg. I thought it was Murdoch, Rupert Murdoch. But, I mean, these kind of people are actually real and trying to control not just their own country, but other countries.
Yeah, I mean, Bloomberg, somebody pointed out that there's 2 billionaires in the race. One of them wasn't on the stage last night. The other chap is a guy called Tom Steyer, who only has a couple of billion. Somebody pointed out that Michael Bloomberg's annual income is more than Tom Steyer's entire personal fortune. This is a billionaire who is now the sympathetic. We're now looking at Tom Steyer, the billionaire, as the plucky underdog in the race. What do you make of this whole Bloomberg thing? Do you think he can survive through the contest, or do you think that the more people actually look at him, they're just going to decide they don't want him?
I mean, seriously.
Yeah.
Wow. To be fair, the candidate of my choice for the Democrats is already out of the race, so I'm looking forward to the next election where he'll be able to stand. That'll be Andrew Yang.
Well, we
is that the young one?
Yeah, we're all big fans of Andrew Yang here.
There's such a dearth of young ones in these races, I suppose because they don't have that kind of money.
Although, yeah, I mean, it is an exceptionally old contest this time. Bloomberg is 79, I think. Bernie Sanders is 78. Warren is 72. Biden is 76, I think. So yeah, there's a lot of
move
very
over.
old
Let the young come in.
If any of those get the nomination, it will be by far the oldest contest ever. And if it's Bloomberg, it'll be by far the richest contest ever. It'll be 2 billionaires going head to head for the American presidency. I mean, we don't have time to go into this in a lot more depth. I do apologise because I could rant about Michael Bloomberg all day.
Really?
It bothers me that somebody that rich can buy their way onto the stage and not even miss the money. That's the most incredible bit about it. He can spend £500 million as he has already, $500 million as he has already, and he won't notice that money is gone. That makes a big difference to how democracy works, I think.
Yeah.
Anyway, just finally, we come back to Glasgow.
Something refreshing.
Yes, we come back to Glasgow for some good news. Glasgow's Green councillors have secured action on the climate emergency and commitments to council reform in negotiations with the city's SNP minority administration. In return for a series of funding and policy commitments, the Greens will vote with SNP councillors to pass the council's annual budget today. We assume that has happened already. Included in the Green Budget deal are a new £10 million Climate Emergency Action Fund to accelerate emissions reductions, work to identify a further £20 million to invest in nature, green networks and food growing, developing a new economic plan centred on a Green New Deal, agreements to reform the council's budget process so it enables better public scrutiny, an end to free city centre car parking and internal UK flights for councillors, and a school bike library pilot as a step towards every child in Glasgow having access to a bike. So this is, I think, news that's got to be welcomed, isn't it, Dave?
Oh, absolutely. It sounds really exciting. But the exciting thing for me is just how many different ways there are to be much more green in the way that you do things and how you live, and how it could help families who are struggling. With if the council invested in ways that heat the homes without the families having to pay vast sums to do so, because heating your home must be one of the biggest ones, and then local food growing. Yeah,
I mean district heating is something that we know somebody who's been working on this for a while. Would you like to comment on that? And food growing the food growing strategy is something I've been working on. That is something that all council areas just now are working on. And if the Greens can push Glasgow to be a little bit more radical, Glasgow.
You and I might just get our dream of the Glasgow
Yes.
graving docks
Yes.
becoming a green growing space.
Yeah.
Can you not remember when SNP first came in 2007 and the First Minister put out a call on social media and he called it a national conversation. And we were all contributing our ideas to this new government. It was a really exciting time. And I can remember proposing that on the high-rise flats in Glasgow, you had platforms that could go up and down that grew plants. And you could share them. Now, we're not far from that. And we've got that sort of thing that's coming from the Hutton Institute, where you've got inside growing.
Yeah.
You could have
I'm not sure if I'm entirely correct on this, but I think Commonweal did an analysis and something like 17 high rises that could fit inside four of which could fit inside the square footage of George Square, could feed the entirety of Glasgow.
Yes.
That's not very much. We can pop them up in a couple of years.
And Glasgow has so much derelict and vacant land that I've been saying for years, as has the Glasgow Community Food Network and various others, been saying for years that we should be turning all of those into farms.
Yes.
Totally achievable. I think as a kind of side note, the Green Party seems to have been perceived in the most recent years, especially last year when they were debating about not passing the Scottish Government's budget and potentially causing a trigger re-election. They got a lot of flack for that. The Green Party also seems to be the ones who are sitting on the green gold of policy for the future, because there is no topic more important.
Yes.
So we're now seeing them use the leverage that they have in terms of being a coalition party, though it is a small part of the coalition overall. They are able to push through policies that the status quo and those in power are not necessarily willing to push without their input. So I think it's quite interesting to see that even a little influenced, if waged appropriately, can have a lot of impact.
Good outcomes.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think in the Netherlands, where they have, is it not all of their trams or trains are run on electricity from wind power?
I'm not sure,
The
but
whole
I think you might
system.
be right. Yeah.
Now, if they can do it, why can't we do it?
There's many times I say that to myself about all sorts of issues, Dave, but unfortunately we don't have time to go into an awful lot more depth. That is all we've got time for tonight. I'd like to thank both Dave Tucker and Ellen Hofer for joining us. It's always a pleasure to talk to both of you, either of you in fact, but both of you together is even better. If you are watching at home and you would like to support Broadcasting Scotland, if you'd like us to be able to make more programmes like this, I hope you would, then please go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register, sign up as a supporter. Your £5 a difference can make a huge difference to the quality, the quantity and the type of programmes that we can produce here on the channel. We're always trying to expand, but there is only so much we can do with a very limited budget. You can also, please remember, we are now on the Amazon Fire Stick. You can go and find the Broadcasting Scotland app there. I'm told it works well. You can let us know yourself. Please do that by contacting us at Broadcast Scot on the Twitter. I'm sure you can also tell us about anything else you want to talk about. Give us tips on news stories or whatever. And if you would like to get involved, this is maybe the most important thing at this point. We are always looking for new people to get involved in the channel here, whether it's as a journalist writing the stories, finding and writing the stories before we broadcast, whether it's being on air, like taking my role, letting me get a night off once in a while. Not that I'm trying to escape, but you know. And if you've got other interests, kind of technical interests, working in cameras or sound or whatever, there's always a role for you here. If you would like to get involved, please get in touch with us, either on the Twitter or on the website at broadcastingscotland.scot. Please get in touch, or just come and visit the studio if you know where we are. I'll give you a hint. That picture behind us is not exactly where we are. It's just in case anyone was wondering if we were set up on at the top of the steps to the concert hall. But anyway, that is all we've got time for tonight. I'm sorry I got a little bit ridiculous at the end of the show there, but sometimes that just happens.
It's called diversity.
Yeah, when you have to deal with so many very depressing stories in,
Yes.
in a show, sometimes we have to have a wee giggle at the end just to get over it. But thank you very much for joining us. We will be back on Sunday as usual with the full Scottish, and then we'll be back on Monday. Gordon will be here with Scotland at 7. Until then, have a great weekend. Cheers. Bye bye.